But I'm really excited to be here at the Aquinas Center. How many of you, is this your first Aquinas Center event? Quite a few of you. I'm so glad about that. Let me just say a couple things about the Aquinas Center for you. We are a center of Catholic thought at Candler School of Theology at Emory University. And we do programming for the university, we do programming for the archdiocese, we do programming for the region. This is my first event. This is the first event that I've organized. And I wanted it to be an event that really celebrated something significant in American Catholic history. This is a diverse and exciting archdiocese. From the 6 weeks that I've been here, this is what I've learned about it. Last week I was at Our Lady of Lourdes. I already told Father Jeffrey that I've got an 18-year-old, a 15-year-old, and a 12-year-old, and when they ask me at the end, Dad, can we go back there? When usually it's a fight to get them to go to Mass, I'm pretty sure I'm going to be back, right? But anyways, it's a wonderful church, and I want the Aquinas Center to be a place that celebrates the wonderful riches that are part of this church here in Atlanta. And one of the wonderful riches, one of the most important aspects of of Catholic life here in Atlanta are Black Catholic churches. Dr. Williams is going to say a little bit more about this, but in June of this last year, Pope Francis recognized the official terminology is recognized the heroic virtues of Mother Mary Lange, put her on the path to sainthood. I don't know, Shannen, did you see the Mother Mary Lange t-shirt over there? Do you mind standing up, sir? Peace hero, Mother Mary Lange. What I wanted to do, this is a substantial and important moment for American Catholicism, right? To have Mother Mary Lange, her heroic virtues recognized, the contribution that she made. And over this, I think it was in the spring, I was on sabbatical from my previous job, and I purchased Shannen's book, Subversive Habits, Black Catholic Nuns in the Long African American Freedom Struggle. I immediately wrote her after I read it because it is one of the best books of Catholic history I have ever read. I don't get any commission on it. It really is fantastic. So if you haven't had a chance to read it, I hope that you do get a chance to read it, and I'm sure that Shannen's presentation is going to give you that much more impetus to do so. So let me introduce her. Dr. Shannen D. Williams is Associate Professor of History at the University of Dayton. She's an award-winning scholar of the African American experience and Black Catholicism with research and teaching specialization in women's, religious, and Black freedom movement history. Dr. Williams holds a BA in History with magna cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa honors from Agnes Scott College. An MA in Afro-American Studies from the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and PhD in History from Rutgers University. The first Black woman elected to the Executive Council of the American Catholic Historical Association, Dr. Williams is a co-founder of the Fleming Morrow Endowment in African American History at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. In 2020, she submitted successful proposals to establish the Mother Mary Lange Lecture in Black Catholic History at Villanova University, and the Cyprian Davis OSB Prize through the American Catholic Historical Association and the Cushwas Center for the Study of American Catholicism. I am so excited that Shannen is my first invitee for the Aquinas Center. Please welcome Dr. Lange.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thank you all for joining us this evening. It really is a pleasure and an honor to be in community with you in celebration of Venerable Mother Mary Lange. Before I begin my formal remarks, I did want to take an opportunity to thank the Aquinas Center, Emory, and also any other sponsors that were involved in making tonight possible. It is truly an honor and a privilege to be able to return to Georgia, to the Decatur area, also just simply to the state. Indeed, I learned to become a historian at Agnes Scott College, and my mother, who is a native of Savannah, Georgia, if she had not encountered Catholicism when my grandparents enrolled her in the Black Catholic schools in Savannah, I may very well have not been the person to write this book. So it's wonderful to be with you. I wanted to begin really by telling you why I believe Mother Lange's story matters so much, and the life and legacy of her Oblate Sisters of Providence are essential to our understanding of the American Catholic experience. And I first need to tell you about how I came to know the story of Mother Mary Lange. Interestingly enough, although I am a cradle Catholic, the only Black sister that I knew growing up and encountered before I entered graduate school in 2006 we'll see how this works. Hold on. There we go. Was Sister Mary Clarence. I entered graduate school with an interest in studying Black women's history, and specifically Black religious women's history in the African American freedom struggle. I knew very little Black Catholic history, and indeed the only Black sister that I knew was Sister Mary Clarence, the fictional character played by Whoopi Goldberg in the Sister Act film franchise. But in graduate school, I wanted to write a paper on Black women in the Black freedom struggle. And interestingly enough, when I began going through microfilmed editions of Black-owned newspapers, I stumbled upon a newspaper article announcing the formation of a Black Power Federation of Catholic nuns established in the wake of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. The article's title alone, Black Sisters Weigh Contradictions in Religious and Secular Communities, immediately piqued my interest. But it was the sort of photograph of these four smiling Black nuns that steadied my hand on the microphone reader that day. I'd never seen Black nuns before, and I felt deeply ashamed. How was it possible that I was a Black Catholic woman and didn't know this history? And although I was ashamed, I soon realized that I was not alone. Even my mother, who had attended Catholic schools for the entirety of her formal education, and who in 1974 became one of the first 3 Black women to graduate from the University of Notre Dame, did not know of the existence of Black nuns in our church. No, only white nuns taught us in our schools, my mother relayed to me on the telephone later that evening. But I wish I had known. I wish we'd had Black nuns in Savannah when I was growing up. And my mother is on the left in pink. Stunned by my mother's revelation, I set out to learn as much as I could about the National Black Sisters Conference and to understand the roots of the invisibility of Black Catholic sisters in our lives. From Father Cyprian Davis's landmark study of the Black Catholic community, I learned among many things that there had been Black nuns in my mother's hometown of Savannah, Georgia in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Before anti-Black prejudice and violent threats pushed these consecrated women out, members of 2 separate all-Black sisterhoods had helped to lay the foundation for and ensure the survival of the city's Black Catholic educational system. Their heroic efforts made my mother's, and by extension my own, journey into Catholicism possible. Yet the white sisters, I think I'll be all right, I'll just hold on. Yet the white nuns and priests who taught my mother and hundreds of other Black children in Savannah during America's civil rights and Black power years never once alluded to Black sisters in their lessons. According to my mother, her white instructors did not teach any Black history or art either. And after calling and writing a host of Catholic institutions to track down some of the sisters and ex-sisters who established the National Black Sisters Conference, I finally began to understand why. The saga of America's Black women who dared to be poor, chaste, and obedient is largely untold, wrote Sister Mary Shawn Copeland in 1975. It is an uneasy story, not only because it is rooted in the American dilemma, racism, but also because the position of a woman in an oppressed group is traditionally delicate and strategic. Now, by the time that I interviewed her, Dr. Copeland was a distinguished professor at Boston College and the first African-American president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. She had also been out of religious life for 13 years. Copeland, who was the first African-American Felician sister in Detroit, Michigan, and later an Adrian Dominican nun, had been one of the conference's most visible leaders. She had also done more than anyone else to preserve the organizations and the history of Black Catholic sisters in the face of marginalization and erasure. In addition to publishing the first scholarly article on the conference, Copeland in the early 2000s arranged for the deposit of the organization's papers at Marquette University. "I'm so glad you're interested in the Black Sisters Conference," Dr. Copeland expressed to me during our first conversation. "We've been waiting on someone to tell this story." Now, while Dr. Copeland's willingness to share her experiences with me proved pivotal, it was Dr. Patricia Gray, the conference's founding president and one of the 4 nuns featured in that Pittsburgh Courier newspaper article, who radically changed my focus. Routinely described by her men and female and women peers as one of the most intellectually talented and charismatic Catholic sisters of her generation, Gray, who was known in religious life as Sister M. Martin de Porres, had been the conference's heart and soul in its formative years. As Pittsburgh's first Black religious sister of mercy and the conference's leading public voice, Gray was also the face and force of what some were calling the new Black nun. However, in 1974, Gray abruptly departed religious life and stopped giving interviews. "I don't like to look back," Dr. Gray frequently repeated during the first of our many conversations over the years. However, after I presented her with a copy of a recently published book on Black sisters' activism and the Black freedom struggle, she quickly changed her mind. Visibly frustrated by the book's erasure of Black sisters' vanguard activism in the Catholic fight for racial justice, its cursory mention of white sisters' longstanding practices of racial discrimination and exclusion, and its glaring omissions about the one Black nun briefly discussed in its pages, the 65-year-old ex-nun quietly stood and departed the room. Several minutes later, she came back and returned with a treasure trove, her personal archive from her tenure in religious life. In handing over the materials, Dr. Gray revealed to me that in the 1970s, the conference's executive board had desired to publish a book documenting Black sisters' history in the United States. She also had lamented the enduring invisibility of Black sisters' lives and labors in church and wider American history. Then, in her great wisdom, Dr. Gray gently encouraged me to consider expanding my attention to the mostly unsung and under-researched history of the nation's Black sisterhoods. We, the MBSC, were not the first Black sisters to revolt in the church, she quietly declared. If you can, try to tell all of our stories. And in particular, Dr. Gray only agreed to speak with me if I first agreed to not write a book just about her or just about the National Black Sisters Conference. She told me to turn my attention to the nation's historically Black sisterhoods, which had made religious life possible for the vast majority of Black women and girls who went into religious life. And indeed, when I began studying the history of the National Black Sisters Conference, what I recognized almost immediately was that the community that sent the largest delegation to the first meeting in Pittsburgh in 1968 were the Oblate Sisters of Providence, founded by Mother Mary Lange. They are not only the nation's oldest Roman Catholic sisterhood freely open to Black women and girls, they are the modern world's first successful Roman Catholic sisterhood freely open to Black women and girls. When they are founded in the Slave Society of Baltimore, Maryland in 1829, they make possible generations of African American women and girls who are called to religious life. They preserve the vocations of thousands of Black women and girls called to religious life, not simply from across the United States, but also from Canada, Latin America, and the Caribbean. That is the story that I want to tell today, to focus specifically on the Oblate Sisters of Providence, because there is no story of American Catholicism, there is no story of women's religious life, and certainly no story of Black Catholic sisters in the United States or in the modern world without Mother Mary Lange and her community of Oblate Sisters of Providence. Now, in the history of the United States, there have been 8 historically Black sisterhoods. All were founded in the South, and all but one were slated to be teaching communities. It is important to remember that the Oblate Sisters of Providence, although being the first successful community, they are not the first Black community of sisters in the United States. There was one failed community briefly organized in Kentucky, but also noting as well that there were plenty of Black women and girls who felt called to religious life in the United States who were not allowed to explore their vocations due to the anti-Black admissions policies of the nation's Black sisterhoods. In the case of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, their success literally came as a result of the Haitian Revolution. She herself was born to Haitian parents in what we believe was Cuba. We know that she was Spanish speaking and also French speaking and did know how to speak in English, although she preferred speaking in French and Spanish. She and her mother flee to the United States as a result of the Haitian Revolution, the rebellion that was launched in Saint-Domingue that became the Haitian Revolution sometime in the late 18th century. We know from oral records that she and her mother first came through Charleston and eventually made their way to Baltimore where they settled. We know that Mother Lange could be found specifically participating in the confraternities for women in Baltimore. She is listed along with the founding members of the Oblate Sisters of Providence by the 1810s. And certainly we know from the oral history of the community and also the surviving written history that she and several of her friends had actually founded a school to be able to serve the free and enslaved Black Catholic populations of Baltimore. Indeed, we know from their founder, Father James Jobert, that they encountered profound resistance. They had already felt called to religious life, but had no communities willing to accept their vocations. From his own diary, Father James Jobert documents this opposition, not only from the wider clerical community, but the entire Catholic community. He wrote, quote, "For more than 10 years, they had wished to consecrate themselves to God for this good work, waiting patiently that in his own infinite goodness, he would show them a way of giving themselves to him." As he agrees to help them, he also tells us of the continued opposition. Now, important to note, the Oblate Sisters of Providence are not simply the nation's first successful Black Roman Catholic sisterhood. They are among the earliest Catholic sisterhoods in the nation. They are the 4th organized in the Diocese of Baltimore, which is the nation's first diocese. Only 3 communities precede them. They are the Carmelites in Baltimore, the Visitation Sisters in Washington, D.C., and the Daughters of Charity established by St. Elizabeth Seton. All of those communities are slave-holding communities. Now again, the records don't tell us who rejected them, but there were only 3 communities ahead of them. Father James Jobert also documents that there was great opposition, with early priests even suggesting that organizing a Black sisterhood should be considered a profanation of the habit. He wrote, quote, "I knew already that many persons who had approved of the idea of a school for pupils disapproved very strongly that of forming a religious house, and could not think of the idea of seeing these poor girls, colored girls, wearing the religious habit and constituting a religious community." We know from the historical record that they faced fierce resistance, also suffer erasure from early Catholic publications, but nonetheless they are able to persevere and survive. Indeed, we know among the earliest Oblate Sisters of Providence are women who had felt called to religious life in other parts of the country at this time and are successful in their vocation simply because of the establishment of the Oblate Sisters of Providence. One early member that I want to draw your attention to give you a sense of why the Oblate Sisters of Providence are so significant, is Anne Marie Beecraft, who became Sister Mary Aloysius Beecraft. That name may be familiar to you in the contemporary period because of its association with Georgetown University and its ongoing efforts to make reparation for its slaveholding past. In the case of Anne Marie Beecraft, the university decided to rename a hall that had been named after one of the Jesuits who was involved in a very infamous trade from the early 19th century. in which they sold over 272 enslaved people away from the Jesuits to settle the university's debts. The university decided to rename that hall, and a sort of competition was given, and sort of her name was selected from students who had read about her story. Interestingly enough, though, they didn't know all of her story. It was clear that they didn't know that she was an Oblate Sister of Providence till a little bit later, which is why the hall is Anne Marie B. Craft and not Sister Mary Aloysius B. Craft Hall. But nonetheless, her story is important. We know, certainly from the first national report on education produced in the United States, that when she was just 15 years old in 1820, she established the first school for black girls, one of the earliest schools for black girls in Washington, D.C., and eventually the first Catholic boarding school for black girls in Washington, D.C., winning the support of a Jesuit. She is in fact described as the most remarkable colored girl of her generation, noted for her piety, her beauty, etc. What's also significant about her story, and the story of so many early Oblate Sisters of Providence like Mother Mary Lange, is that their story and her genealogical roots go back to the earliest days of the church, to both the free and enslaved black and white Catholics who built it. In the case of Anne Marie B. Craft, we know that her father, William B. Craft, was, quote, the natural son of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, unquote. Charles Carroll of Carrollton is the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. He is cousin to Bishop John Carroll, who is the nation's first bishop. Charles Carroll of Carrollton is also one of the nation's earliest largest slaveholders in Maryland, and an early benefactor to the church. So to give us a sense of what Mary Lange and what the early Oblate Sisters of Providence are doing when they found this community and when the support of the early church community, as they begin to preserve the vocations of women whose stories remind us that Black Catholic history has always been Catholic history. People who remind us that it is impossible to tell the story of Black Catholic sisters in the United States honestly and accurately without confronting the church's largely unacknowledged and painful history of slavery, segregation, and exclusion. It also comes to help us to understand why Black sister stories and why Mother Lange's or Lange's story extends beyond the Oblate Sisters of Providence. Indeed, when you study the history of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, you will come to learn that this community is not only responsible for the success of so many women who felt called to religious life, but it will also give birth to 3 other communities of sisters in the United States. 2, one that would be historically Black, one that would be predominantly white, and one that would be founded as an interracial contemplative community. The first community that I want to address to give us a sense of the legacy of the Oblate Sisters of Providence are the Sister Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, the IHM Sisters. They are considered to be among the most distinguished communities of Catholic sisters, of educators in the nation. They have founded 3 colleges and universities over the course of their history, and a host of academies for girls. Their foundress was actually a foundress of the Oblate Sisters of Providence. This is Mother Teresa Maxis Duchemin, one of the original 4 charter members of the Oblate Sisters of Providence. Although the Oblate Sisters of Providence are very successful in their earliest decade, after the death of Father James Joubert, they run into a crisis. The Archbishop of Baltimore does not believe that there is any place for Black sisters in under his jurisdiction anymore, and attempts to suppress the community. They eventually find a Belgian priest who is willing to advocate for them and prostrate himself before the bishop to ensure their survival. However, in the chaos of that moment, 3 members decide to leave the community in hopes of founding their own community. They eventually work with the Belgian priest to establish the first Catholic sisterhood in the state of Michigan. Mother Teresa Maxis Duchemin and another Oblate Sister of Providence leave, and eventually sort of send word back to that 3rd Oblate Sister of Providence that she would not be able to join them in Michigan. And they tell her that she's too dark. And it's clear that they can only found a white community in Michigan. Initially, the IHM sisters are named the Sisters of Providence, but soon rename themselves into the Sister Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. And indeed, we begin to see the challenges of color within the American Catholic Church. In the case of Mother Teresa Maxis Duchemin, her community is very successful from the very beginning. In fact, she expands quickly out of Michigan into western Pennsylvania and eventually into eastern Pennsylvania. But she also runs afoul of the bishops. She's too independent. She doesn't necessarily feel like she needs to always gain permission before she decides to do things with her community. And so what's interesting, because the bishops do know her secret, their correspondence oftentimes reflects sort of that knowledge, but also their own racial prejudices. Indeed, two bishops writing to each other in 1859, one noting, quote, "I tremble when I think of the impression which we made when our good people discovered that their daughters have been sent to be placed under a mulatto superior. I do not think we are yet ripe for such an anomaly." She runs into so much trouble that, in fact, in order to save her community from being suppressed by the bishop, she decides to go into exile. And for almost 20 years, she is living with the Grey Nuns of Ottawa, Canada. When she is very old, she receives permission to return to the community that she founds. She passes away in Pennsylvania, is buried with her community, but subsequently they decide to erase their African American heritage. They do not cite Mother Teresa or Sister Anne Constance Shape, the other Oblate Sister of Providence, as their foundress. Instead, they assign that to their third member. They also decide to close their archive because they know that anyone sort of looking into it would understand and find out that she had been a member of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, simply meaning then, of course, that she was a woman of African descent. And they do so for quite some time. In 1928, we have one letter from a superior in Monroe, Michigan, noting, quote, "We are convinced that silence is the fairest, wisest, and most agreeable way of committing to oblivion this subject." And that, of course, is their African American roots. It's really not until the early 1990s that the community does officially apologize, adopt an anti-racist platform, and one of the first things that they do is they open up their archives to make it very clear what they had done. They also engage every 3 years in a reunion ceremony with the Oblate Sisters of Providence, acknowledging those roots. Interestingly enough, though, I think it's always important to note, if you do have a copy of the book, in most instances, if you go to any IHM website, any of their university websites, the image on the right is the image that you will see of Mother Teresa Max's Duchemin. It is an etching. On the left, that is the actual photo that they have of their foundress. It is the only photo that I know to exist of Mother Teresa Max's Duchemin. You can see very clearly that the etching is based on the photograph. And, you know, it was very interesting until I saw the photograph, what had happened. The photograph on the right, the etching on the right shows Mother Teresa Max's wearing the habit of the IHMs. On the left, she's not wearing the habit of the community that she founds. She's wearing the habit of the Grey Nuns of Ottawa. It is the habit of the community that took her in exile. The photo documents the exile, which is why the photo is not used, because it tells that story. And so as much as we think of the story of Mother Lange, we must always think about the challenges of race and racism and white supremacy. And certainly, even though her community gives birth to the IHM sisters, it is still an uneasy relationship based on that history of racism. But what is significant about the Oblate Sisters of Providence, unlike their counterparts in the early American church, they are not a slaveholding community. One of the key points to take away about the story of Venerable Mother Mary Lange is the fact that her Oblate Sisters of Providence never allow a member to bring in an enslaved person as a part of their dowry. They never rely on the labor of enslaved people as a part of their day-to-day ministries. They could have. The vast majority of religious orders of men and women in the United States and in the wider Americas absolutely do, because the Catholic Church is the largest corporate slaveholder in the Americas. Also in places like Maryland, Florida, Louisiana, Kentucky, and Missouri, which are the cradles of American Catholicism. But the Oblate Sisters of Providence go even further. Not only do they disavow slavery by refusing to engage in the institution, by also in educating the children of enslaved people and children who are enslaved, but they also allow, prior to the federal abolition of slavery in 1865, they allow women who were born into slavery to enter into their ranks. They are the first U.S. Catholic sisterhood to reject the racist and sexist notion that a woman born into slavery lacked the virtue necessary to enter religious life. Before 1865, the community will admit at least 8 women who were born into slavery. And at least one of those women was still enslaved when they admitted her into the community, and she is able to gain her freedom, we don't know how, before she is allowed to profess vows. The community does have the manumission records of all of those members who were born into slavery. This is one. This is Ellen Joseph West, who was born into slavery in the late 18th century. And we know quite a bit about her because at the turn of the 20th century, she is believed to be the oldest Catholic sister in the country, which means there were a lot of media attention to her. The New York Times and the Washington Post all ran stories on her. And this is her manumission record. And this is significant because when we think about those who attempt to excuse the slaveholding and segregationist peers, or attempt to exclude the slaveholding and segregationist practices of Catholics of Catholics, they oftentimes attempt to say, well, they're just simply people of those times. Telling the story of Mother Mary Lange and her Oblate Sisters of Providence remind us that they are also people of those times. They are the essential counterpoint. And indeed, when we begin to look at who joins the Oblate Sisters of Providence, we also are invited to remind ourselves of the important aspects of Black Catholics who were involved specifically in the fight for African American education and for freedom and civil rights at every turn. Some of the earliest sisters to enter the community are a part of families that have been actively, I know the mic is.
We're having mic issues. Give me 1 second.
No problem.
I hate you're on a roll. Try that one. We'll just keep cycling through.
Yes, we will. What I want to do specifically is to give you a sense of the profile of the young women who began to enter the Oblate Sisters of Providence, especially after the federal abolition of slavery, that sort of finally removed the greatest barrier to Black women who felt called to religious life. Again, these women's stories give us insight into the power of the Black Catholic community, but also help us to upend the myth that suggests that Black Catholics were apolitical or indifferent to the fight for racial justice within the United States and within their own church. The image on the left is Sister Mary Gertrude Smallwood. She enters the Oblate Sisters of Providence soon after the federal abolition of slavery. We know she is born into a free Black family, either in Philadelphia, although we know her father is from Maryland, specifically from a segment of Catholic Maryland. Her father, Joseph Smallwood, had eventually left to try to make a fortune in California and serves as a delegate into all the colored conventions of the 19th century. His son, James Smallwood, is the first African-American juror in York, Pennsylvania. He also establishes the first African-American school in York, Pennsylvania. Another son serves as a private secretary to Salmon P. Chase, who was the Chief Justice of the United States, and his daughter Lydia enters the Oblate Sisters of Providence and becomes Sister Mary Gertrude, eventually serving in their ministries in New Orleans, also in St. Louis. Many of these individuals could also trace their lineage to those who were enslaved by the church. I want to draw your attention specifically also to the Wade family. The Wade family, specifically the children of Benjamin and Caroline Wade, who come out of St. Mary's County in Maryland, will send several of their children into religious life. The Wade family would send 2 daughters, Sister Mary Angela and Sister Mary Pius, into the Oblate Sisters of Providence. They also had an aunt, Sister Mary Josepha Wade, who had been an early member of the Oblate Sisters of Providence. Their brother, Father Francis Wade, was in fact one of the first 4 African-American SVD priests. The Oblate Sisters of Providence also connect to the other stories of the historically Black orders. Another early Oblate Sister of Providence had actually been a former Holy Family sister, a member of the Sisters of the Holy Family, founded by Venerable Henriette DeLille, who was another African American on the road to sainthood within our church. Particularly in the late 19th century, one member, who was an early member who entered in the 1860s, who was named Elizabeth Wallace, but as an Oblate Sister of Providence became Sister Mary Ursula Wallace, entered the Oblate Sisters of Providence after she left the Sisters of the Holy Family, after she played a leading role specifically in helping the Sisters of the Holy Family remove. Unlike the Oblate Sisters of Providence, the Sisters of the Holy Family were a community founded in New Orleans in 1842 that initially restricted its membership to free women of color of elite status. And in 1867, they received an application from a formerly enslaved woman who was also a cook for the Archbishop of New Orleans. And when the community decided to take a vote on whether or not to accept this, the community split. In response, we know that the third foundress, Mother Josephine Charles, and also Sister Elizabeth Wallace were leading figures in that vote. In the case of Sister Elizabeth Wallace, we know that she was also the first principal of St. Mary's Academy, which is their chief academy and the nation's second oldest Black Catholic school, the first being St. Francis Academy, established by the Oblate Sisters of Providence in Baltimore in 1828. The Oblate Sisters of Providence, again, also preserve the vocations of Black women. Maybe I'll try another one, sorry.
Apparently, our technician tells us that it's a result of cellular activity in downtown Atlanta.
Okay.
And so it's actually not our sound system, it's that we're addicted to our phones.
Okay, no problem. As I said, one of the great stories of Black Catholic sisters in the United States and the story of the Oblate Sisters of Providence is their ability to preserve the vocations of Black women and girls from across the United States, but also Canada, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Indeed, the Oblate Sisters of Providence are always a multi-ethnic and multilingual community. And indeed, they are also preserving the vocations of these young Black girls who are educated by white sisters who feel called to the charism of their white Catholic educators, but are subsequently denied admission into those communities solely on the basis of race. If you go through the files of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, those who were not educated by the Oblate Sisters of Providence or educated by Black sisters were oftentimes educated by white sisters and then rejected admission into those communities. An early example would involve a young woman named Louisa Glenn. She, in fact, is the first African-American graduate, first graduate of the historically Black, Blessed, later St. Peter Claver School for Black Catholics in San Antonio, Texas, to enter religious life. That community is founded by servant of God, Mother Margaret Healy. This particular instance, because she has rejected admission into that particular community, she is encouraged to enter the Oblate Sisters of Providence, what she does in 1896 and remains until her death in 1945. Also significant to note, the Oblate Sisters of Providence are also preserving the vocation of Black women and girls who are oftentimes given the opportunity to join white communities if in fact they are racially ambiguous. So it's important to understand most white communities, those that do eventually accept African American candidates, do so after World War II. However, there are some communities that are willing to make exceptions before them. And oftentimes this is basically related to sort of racial ambiguity. Most communities would take women who were of Native American descent, those who were of Latina descent, but not of African descent, and also take women of Asian descent. Now, oftentimes those women of color were relegated to a lesser status within their communities, oftentimes relegated to domestic labor. So for a Black woman who wanted to enter into a white community, if you were racially ambiguous, if you could be perceived as non-Black, sometimes a community would be willing to make an exception for you. But oftentimes only if you agree to cut ties with your living family members. What we recognize is that there are some women who do make that choice, but the vast majority of racially ambiguous Black women who are presented with that choice refuse to do so. One example from the Oblate Sisters of Providence is one of their most distinguished superiors beyond Mother Mary Lange, and that is of Rebecca Clifford, who became Mother Mary Consuela Clifford. She was educated by the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament at their St. Francis de Sales Academy in Rock Castle, Virginia. And in 1905, she rejected an offer from an unnamed white sisterhood in Philadelphia who was willing to admit her on the condition that she agreed to cut ties with her visibly black mother. Instead, she joins the Oblate Sisters of Providence and eventually becomes their superior in 1926 and leads the community until her death in 1937. And I wanted to draw your attention specifically to her decision because we do have a record of what she reportedly said. We know that she meets with one of her former teachers who was a Sister of the Blessed Sacrament, that community who had also rejected her. And the reason why this opportunity came about is because she had an older brother who was willing to leave the family behind to pass for white, but who did not want to leave his younger sister behind. And so he worked with a white priest to find a community willing to accept her. And this is her response. That I should not have my mother visit me, I think positively wrong and not the will of God. My mother is making a great sacrifice in giving up her only daughter to God. She is doing it most willingly. Should I impose an unnecessary sacrifice upon her? She also maintained, my decision in this is that the white people have many to work for them, but the colored people have very few. They are my own people, and I think God wants me to give them the first place, and I don't think I would be blessed if I were to do otherwise. It is a powerful statement for a young woman to make, and we know that young black women and girls who are racially ambiguous, who are given this opportunity, make this decision over and over again. And they're able to make this decision because of the reality of the historically black orders, specifically also the Oblate Sisters of Providence. The second community that the Oblate Sisters of Providence give rise to is the third or the youngest of the African American sisterhoods, which was the seventh African American sisterhood, the Franciscan Sisters, the Franciscan Handmaids of the Most Pure Heart of Mary. Their foundress, Eliza Barber Williams, a former Oblate novice. So if you've ever seen the Oblate habit, it seems very similar to that, particularly the habit from 1902 until the 1960s. It looks very similar to the handmaid habit, and it's simply because they're the same habit. Mother Theodore, and she got the religious name in Theodore when she was an Oblate novice, when she left the community, she just simply took the habit with her. And when she was invited to come into Georgia, specifically to Savannah, in response to a 1915 law that was being proposed by the Georgia State Legislature, which would have effectively barred African American children from the Catholic educational system, as it sought to bar African American teachers from teaching white children and white teachers from teaching black children. She decides to come in at the invitation of a white priest who had been ministering in the African American community and found a new community. It's why the handmaids, in many ways, are very close and similar to the Oblate Sisters of Providence. This community, though, will not survive in Savannah for very long. They will face profound resistance to their presence, eventually leaving first to serve as domestics in New Jersey before they are invited to first minister in a Catholic nursery school in Harlem, and then eventually begin to establish Black Catholic schools in Harlem. The Oblate Sisters of Providence, from the late 19th century up until the 1950s, would be the largest African American sisterhood in the nation. They expanded their ministries beyond Baltimore throughout the Deep South in North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, but also moving into the Midwest, into places like Detroit, Chicago, Minnesota. They go further north into New Jersey and also into New York. At the turn of the 20th century, they also become the first Catholic sisterhood to minister to the Afro-Cuban population and eventually move into Costa Rica as well. Women who join the community are a mix of both cradle Catholics and converts to the faith. Some other women whose stories will be revealed as more attention is turned to the Oblate Sisters of Providence and more attention is turned to Mother Mary Lange are women like Sister Mary Claude Hudlin. She is a descendant of Peter and Nancy Hudlin, who were conductors on the Underground Railroad, but also parents who were deeply involved in the civil rights struggle of the early 20th century. She was a public school teacher who eventually entered into the Oblate Sisters of Providence after serving for over a decade as a public school teacher. And just to note, if the name Hudlin rings a bell, it's because she is also an aunt of Reginald and Warrington Hudlin, sort of the African-American directors who gave us House Party and Boomerang as well. They're part of that very distinguished family. This is Sister Mary Visitation Falls, who was a daughter of Arthur and Angelica Pre Falls. Her mother was a descendant of Creoles of Louisiana who migrated to Chicago. Her mother was very involved in the suffragist movement, a member of Ida B. Wells's Suffrage Club. She was also a member of the League of Women Voters. Her brother was Dr. Arthur Falls, who was the founder of the first Chicago Workers Movement, who worked with Dorothy Day. She herself was a teacher and then entered into the Oblate Sisters of Providence in the first half of the 20th century. In some cases, when we look at the stories of early Oblate Sisters of Providence, we begin to see how white Catholics also fought against racial segregation and exclusion within the church at a time in which it was not favorable. This is Innocence Chenoweth, who became Sister Mary Alice Chenoweth. She enters into the Oblate Sisters in Providence in 1936, but this was after she was rejected admission into the community of her childhood educators, the Sisters of the Blessed Virgin of the Mary, in 1934. And also the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, founded by St. Catherine Drexel. Interestingly about her story, she is born to a German-American mother and an African-American father. After she is rejected admission into the BVM sisters, her mother is really transformed by the experience. After Sister Mary Alice Chenoweth's father dies, her mother decides to become a lay worker for the BVM sisters. She is concerned about the lost vocations that are taking place and that are emerging from these schools. And in fact, when I interviewed Sister Mary Alice Chenoweth and several other Oblate Sisters of Providence, they reminded me of the work of her mother, Victoria. One of the schools that she decided to work at with the BVM sisters was St. Augustine's in Memphis, Tennessee. We know that she is able to preserve the vocations of 3 African-American girls who were educated by the BVMs, but who are told that there was no community to accept them. And we know that after they experienced that rejection, Mrs. Chenoweth would pull them always to a side and say, well, I know of a community that will accept you, and would tell them about the Oblate Sisters of Providence. And interestingly enough, the sisters would say, you know, we actually didn't know the Oblates were a Black community until we got there, because she never let on that she had an African-American daughter. And indeed, what we have in this story are women and girls who are traveling hundreds and even thousands of miles away from their hometowns, willing to be able to answer God's call in their lives and enter a community willing to accept them. And oftentimes, this was the Oblate Sisters of Providence. These are the famous Burke sisters of Louisville, Kentucky. They are the daughters of Emma and Charles Burks, who are descendants of enslaved Black Catholics who helped build the Holy Land in Kentucky. They send 5 of their daughters into the Oblate Sisters of Providence. One young Burke sister becomes ill and is forced to leave the convent, but the remaining Burke sisters remain until their deaths, with the last Burke sister dying not that long ago. There are also the Prices of Baltimore, Maryland, the children of George and Lillian Price, of St. Peter Claver Catholic Church in Baltimore, Maryland. They send 5 of their children into religious life, 4 daughters into the Oblate Sisters of Providence, and 1 son into the Josephite community, which is a community that ministers primarily in the African-American community. In the case of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, they also intervene when children suffer major tragedies in their life. This is Sister Felix Manzila. She herself was the daughter of a lynched Black professor in Oklahoma. Her father, Wayne Manzila, was the first African-American graduate of Mount Union College or University in Ohio in 1888. He then went on to lead the first Black public high school in Dallas, Texas, before he became a mathematics professor at Langston University or Langston College in Oklahoma. Soon thereafter, he was murdered. His family, according to the family oral history, that he was lynched. And although the newspapers initially reported that, they eventually said that he may have committed suicide, which gave the insurance company the reason to not pay out on his life insurance. In response, the children fell into great poverty. forcing their mother to turn them over to a Catholic priest who took them from Oklahoma to a black Catholic orphanage in Kansas, the only one that would accept them. And the orphanage that accepted them was run by the Oblate Sisters of Providence. So they were saved by the Oblate Sisters of Providence, both the daughters and the sons. One daughter became an Oblate Sister of Providence. Members of the Oblate Sisters of Providence are also foot soldiers in the fight to desegregate Catholic higher education. After World War I, state laws began to change, requiring the accreditation of private school teachers in order to get the certification of their schools. In response, members of the African American sisterhoods, led by the Oblate Sisters of Providence, are forced to find ways to desegregate the nation's Catholic colleges and universities, which overwhelmingly exclude people of color solely on the basis of race. And so in the 1920s, we know that members of the Oblate Sisters of Providence very quietly began to desegregate institutions like St. Louis University, Villanova. They will also desegregate a host of other sort of smaller Catholic colleges and universities. This is Sister Mary Lange Short, who is the first African-American graduate of St. Louis University. Although St. Louis University will tell you that their first African-American students came in 1944. The first African-American students were Oblate Sisters of Providence. And this is just the front page of her bachelor's thesis. She earned her BA in education in 1935, writing her thesis on James Weldon Johnson, the NAACP leader, and also the author of the Negro National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. Her thesis is not only sort of a survey of his life, but also provides an early survey of Black or African-American literature. And what's significant about this, because she is stationed in St. Louis, she is also stationed then at her orders, St. Rita's Academy, which is the first Black Catholic high school in St. Louis. And so if one were to take a survey of the student newspapers, the curricula of the sisters, we know that they are also teaching their students African-American literature and also Black history. Indeed, the Oblate Sisters of Providence are the first of the church to teach, celebrate, and promote Black and Black Catholic history within church boundaries. We also know they intervene in moments of crisis in the African American community. This is Sister Henrietta Butler. She was stationed at St. Rita's Academy in the 1920s, particularly when the community decides to buy a property in an all-white community and they face a riot from their white neighbors. What's interesting is we do have an account of it written from her. This is a typed copy of her handwritten account of what happened, but it also provides a history of St. Rita's Academy. And in the beginning of the diary, she also notes that in 1921, her community had served as a safe haven for the children or Black children who survived the Tulsa massacre. She describes how the children of doctors, lawyers, and the undertakers were all sent. They all fled to St. Louis. And she says, and she describes how the parents were begging them to take the daughters because they had a boarding academy. And in this particular document, she also talks about the undertaker. And she said, you know, they had cut off his ears because he refused to bury the white victims of the Tulsa massacre because they didn't want people to know that white people had died too, that Black people had defended themselves. And so they cut his ears off, and then they took his daughter too. And so what's interesting in this documentation is that she's giving us the names of the family who survived it and the daughters, and the parents begging them to let the younger daughters sleep in the same bed with their older sisters because they were so afraid. The frightening thing is, though, just 1 year later, those same girls will be subjected to another riot when they moved into this all-white community. And their neighbors came after them to the point where they have to call the police to protect them. And it's interesting, she also notes that although the Archbishop did say that they were okay to buy their property, the Monsignor threatened them, came by, threatened them, and eventually a white layman was hired who had to arm himself to protect them because people were attacking the convent day in and day out. Despite that, the Oblate Sisters of Providence will persevere, winning allies within the church, oftentimes also pushing boundaries in the form of higher education, specifically at the Catholic University of America. Indeed, they finally find support from the Archbishop of Baltimore, Michael Curley, who does eventually intervene in the policies at Catholic University, eventually making way for 2 members of the community to become its first Black women graduates in 1934. In the early 1950s, early Oblate Sisters of Providence, Catherine Bentley and Naomi Smith, Catherine Bentley on the left, Naomi Smith on the right, also desegregate Loyola University of Maryland, becoming its first Black women graduates in 1953, and the first Black students in the graduate program. Black women who begin to desegregate white communities still have connections to the Oblate Sisters of Providence. Many of them had been educated by the Oblate Sisters of Providence and were encouraged by their communities to try to test the limits of the barriers after World War II. In some cases, Black women who were going to preserve their vocations with the Oblate Sisters of Providence do eventually go on and desegregate white communities. Such was the case for the first interracial Dominican monastery in Marbury, Alabama. Their first Black member, Lilia Jones, who was going to enter the Oblate Sisters of Providence until this community was established specifically to target the anti-Black admissions policies of contemplative orders. In other instances, we know that the Oblate Sisters of Providence in particular serve as allies and supporters of young Black women and girls who wanted to desegregate white communities by simply choosing to attend their investiture and profession ceremonies. Early profession ceremony of the first 5 Sisters of St. Mary from St. Louis, Missouri. If you notice in this photograph, there are 2 Oblate Sisters of Providence who are seated in the audience. Because so many of these young women had been educated by them or they knew them in their parishes, they always wanted to be present when these women were breaking these barriers. One, because the Oblate Sisters of Providence could not do it, but also to let those young women know that they would be there just in case. And indeed, throughout the Jim Crow era, the Oblate Sisters of Providence would also preserve the vocations of pioneering Black sisters in white communities who had to leave their communities because they were not welcomed. In some cases, we know some girls that desegregate white communities had family members who were rejected from those same communities who became Oblate Sisters of Providence. In the case of the Religious Sisters of Mercy, who educated scores and indeed hundreds of Black children over the decades, when they are forced with applications from Black girls supported by white priests beginning in the 1946, they do everything within their power to try to circumvent racial desegregation. In this particular episode recounted in their general minutes from 1946, they note that in Chicago, a priest was sending in an application to support 2 colored girls who were applying to their community. It notes that, quote, the problem was discussed by the General Council, but no action was taken. Mother asked the members of the General Council to give it serious thought and fervent prayer. When priests also put pressure on communities, asking very, very direct moral questions, such as this one from Reverend John F. O'Brien, who was a pastor of a Black church in Harlem in 1946. Is the order Catholic enough to accept colored vocations? I'm in a colored parish, and I'm immediately concerned with this information. The response that he would get would be no, no, no. And in particular, when we look at the annals and the General Council minutes and the correspondence of white communities and examine how they respond to this particular episode, we see how committed they are to white supremacy and racial segregation within their own ranks. In the case of the Religious Sisters of Mercy, this is from their superior writing to the so many applications, enclosed is a copy of a letter that I received from one of our mothers, provincial relative to the acceptance of colored girls to our institute. The problem is forced upon us because of the number of colored students we now teach in our schools. Even though the training of colored subjects would necessarily differ in some respect from the training of other subjects, the colored would no doubt resent a separate novitiate. It seems too at this time that the sisters in general would not welcome colored subjects into our present novitiates. It gives us clear insights to why the Oblate Sisters of Providence were always going to these profession ceremonies. They suspected that they would not be welcomed, and it's been proven. And indeed, if we just read this particular excerpt from this letter, one, it's significant because it tells us that white sisters thought Black girls who felt called to religious life were problems before they ever stepped foot inside the convent. They were never given the chance. Number two, they admit that the sisters in general would not welcome them at this time. They admit that anti-Blackness is not seen as disqualifying from religious life for white sisters. They admit it. And so when we think about who these young women are and their stories, they give us a sense of the extraordinary efforts of what it would have taken to integrate these communities, but also gives us a sense of the kinds of barriers that they would have faced. I tell this story, although she's not an Oblate Sister of Providence, but she has a direct connection to the community, because this is Sister Cora Marie Billings, who was the first African-American to be accepted into the Religious Sister of Mercy, who is going to stay. She is still alive. I tell her story because she's admitted in 1956 in Philadelphia. She had two aunts who had also been educated by the Religious Sisters of Mercy, who were rejected admission solely on the basis of race, and they became Oblate Sisters of Providence, and they remained Oblate Sisters of Providence until their deaths. Their father was John Aloysius Lee Sr., who was the second African-American graduate of Philadelphia's Roman Catholic High School, which is the nation's first Catholic high school. He's also the first African-American to play on a Catholic basketball team. It's a great story that I'll come to at the very end, but what's significant is that after he graduates from high school, he begins a career as a postal worker, becomes a postal supervisor. But throughout Philadelphia, he founds all of these separate sports programs to ensure that Black children have access to basketball, swimming, golf, track, etc. His father was William Henry Lee, who was one of the enslaved people who labored against his will for the Jesuits at Georgetown. Just to give you a sense of who the Oblate Sisters of Providence are and what they're responding to. When the Oblate Sisters of Providence expand their ministries across the United States, they are always having to turn priests down. Oftentimes because there's so much need and there are so few Oblate Sisters of Providence. So oftentimes when we see and look at the communities that they choose to engage in, we get a glimpse into the power of Black lay women. The woman who is seated here, her name is Anna Bates. She was also known as Medea or Madra Bates. The Oblate Sisters of Providence go to Detroit, Michigan in 1949 after a decades-long plea from Anna Bates calling for the Catholic Church to establish a parish in Northwest Detroit. Because at the time there was no Catholic parish that would accept African Americans. In fact, she, for over a decade, walked 5 miles to and from the only church in her neighborhood that would accept them. She had children, and so she had to stop walking. And so she basically organized a prayer group in her home until the church eventually agreed to sort of establish a parish. And in 1949, the Oblate Sisters of Providence come to Detroit, and they remain for over 6 decades. What's significant is that if you go through Our Lady of Victory's file at the Oblate Sisters of Providence, most of the photos from the parish always feature Medea Bates. And if you'll notice, she's always given the place of honor, that they surround her with a sense of how important Black lay women are to supporting Black sisters' efforts, but also a reminder that when we tell the history of the Black Catholic Church, we oftentimes forget sort of the role of Black lay women. But it was interestingly enough, when I was going through the files of Our Lady of Victory, when Medea Bates dies, the annalist, who was an Oblate Sister of Providence, marks in the annals, and she says, "It's a terrible day. Medea Bates has died. She founded Our Lady of Victory Parish. Everyone is upset." And then she documents how people from across the city came to pay their respects because everyone knew who she was. Yet in the same file, there was an official history of the parish, and Medea Bates was not mentioned once. So without the Oblate Sisters of Providence documenting that history, we would have lost it. Because she was a lay woman, technically she can't found a church, right? The Oblate Sisters of Providence are also significant in the civil rights movement. We know that the Oblate Sisters of Providence in Chicago, Detroit, and also Newark host civil rights leaders in their parishes, in their schools, when other institutions refuse to do so. In 1965, Sister Maria Infanta Gonzalez, who later becomes the superior of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, founds the first Head Start school in Washington, D.C., and then 1 year later, it becomes the first Catholic sister to head an anti-poverty program in Florida. She goes on to become a founding member of the National Black Sisters Conference. Her aunt was Sister Mary Consolata Gibson, who was one of the two first graduates of the Catholic University of America, Black women graduates of the Catholic University of America. Black sisters also marched for open housing in Baltimore. They participate in desegregation sit-ins in Charleston, South Carolina. And they also, following Dr. King's assassination, speak out against racial injustice. They are always involved as educators, and sometimes when they're able, also participating in direct action programs. Many of them had already been involved prior to entering religious life, and it will certainly erupt by the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This here is a photograph of the Memorial March held after Dr. King's death in Mobile, Alabama. It's considered to be the turning point movement in Mobile. It's the moment in which people move towards direct action and are able to bring the city fathers to the table. And if you go through the records, there is a nun there, and she is an Oblate Sister of Providence. And I don't know if you can see her, but she's right there. And this is Sister Francine Johnson. Other Black sisters, this is Dr. Marcelina Brooks. She was Sister Mary Marcelina Brooks, who was the principal of several of the Oblate schools in Washington, D.C. She will eventually leave the community. She is a vice president of the National Black Sisters Conference, but will go on to become the first woman president of Bowie State College, now university in Maryland. I say this all when we think about the legacy of the Oblate Sisters of Providence and the institutions that they helped to desegregate. Again, they are some of the earliest Black students in various Catholic institutions across the country. Even if we look at the Catholic University of America again, remember that once they open the doors of the Catholic University of America, if you read through the book, there is an agreement that the Oblate Sisters of Providence very quietly make with the leaders of the Catholic University of America. And they said, if you open the doors for us and we do a good job, you must open the doors to all Black people, not just us. And so the Catholic University of America, just within a decade later, would graduate the first African American woman to earn a PhD in mathematics, and eventually would also educate another African American sister on the road to sainthood. This is Sister Thea Bowman, servant of God, Sister Thea Bowman, who earns her PhD in English from the Catholic University of America in the early 1970s and teaches the university's first course in African American literature. She's also a founding member of the National Black Sisters Conference. But again, thinking about the legacy of the Oblate Sisters of Providence is not simply the work that the sisters did, but also looking at their students, looking at the doors that were open. What did they make possible? American professional achievement. Their third sisterhood, born of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, is an interracial Benedictine community founded by a former Oblate Sister of Providence, Sister Wilhelmina Lancaster. Her name has been in the news lately, specifically because her community believes that her body is incorrupt. And so there's a lot of conversation that we are all paying attention to at this moment. I do think it's important to remember, though, that she was a former Oblate Sister of Providence. She is a descendant of enslaved Black Catholics from St. Genevieve, Missouri. And while there's a lot of conversation about her, it's important to remember she is a member of the Oblate Sisters of Providence. In all of her writings, when she leaves the Oblate Sisters of Providence, she is very grateful to the community. She is very thankful for the community because it is the community that preserves her vocation. And what I want to do in ending, thinking about the legacy of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, is to basically give you a sense of how much information is still out there waiting to be gleaned. Since I've published this book, or since it was announced, scores of people from across the country who are educated by Black sisters, but especially the Oblate Sisters of Providence, have reached out to me. They said, oh, I had a wonderful Oblate Sister of Providence. One woman on Twitter asked, are the Oblate Sisters of Providence included in your book? And I said, yes, of course. And she said, wonderful. My most favorite teacher, the most wonderful person in the world, was Sister Emily Burks. And I said, oh my goodness, I have included a photo of the family. I hope you get a copy of the book. There are people who reached out, and they remind you in itself of how individual Catholics, lay Catholics, are the keepers of so much of this history. This is Irving Fordham, who was educated by the Oblate Sisters of Providence in their school, their Immaculate Conception School in Charleston, South Carolina. In addition, right, so as a historian, we only sort of get sort of the archival work. But he also told a story about the Oblate Sisters of Providence, and he said, you know, they would make unannounced home visits. You never knew when the nuns would make house calls. Who does that these days? They really cared. They were strict and disciplined. Other schools at the time, other schools at the time weren't that tough. Our black nun principal made every student cover every book with a book cover. Sister Paul walked through the school and insisted that you took every school book home at night. She also talks about sort of the billy club that she caught. But it was also very interesting. He noted, quote, and it was a pre-rehearsed drill on manners. If your teacher introduced a guest to your class, the teacher would say, "Class, this is Mrs. Jefferson." And at attention and in unison, the class would respond, "Good morning, Miss Jefferson, may God bless you." Sort of the memories that the students of the Oblates in itself tell me things that I would have never known just simply going through the archive. A retired caseworker from Baltimore sort of reached out to me noting, quote, "In the 1990s, I had the pleasure of working with a nun from the Oblate Order in Baltimore who was volunteering at a small group home for HIV positive babies. This was at a time AIDS was fierce, so the good work of Mother Lange continues." And I said, "Do you remember her name?" And he was like, "I don't know." Well, my memory has some holes, but I want to say Sister Marie Vianney. She was an older retired school principal from one of the schools in Baltimore, an extremely dedicated person. The home was Char House in Baltimore. And I told him, I was like, "That's enough, I can find her." And there she is. And what's funny, it's also in her file, there are letters from her superior because she would work all night, because she would stay all night. And they were concerned about her safety because she would come home so late. But just to speak to her dedication to the children. I also think now about the contemporary moment, and specifically sort of the story of Angel Reese, who was a part of the LSU women's basketball championship team from last year. She's a graduate of St. Francis Academy, and she has just recently given $12,000 to the scholarship fund that had paid for her education there. And when I think about her story, I also want to make sure that you understand that she is also a product and a part of the legacy of Mother Mary Lange. When we think about her decision to empower young black girls, to educate them, I see this in the example, but I also want to sort of draw your attention specifically to the basketball. The Oblates were always known for their academics, but they should also be known for their athletics. Indeed, in South Carolina and other schools, they had state championship basketball teams, the boys and the girls. And who was their coach, we'll come to. But this is Judge Arthur McFarland, who is a graduate of Bishop England High School, which is a Catholic high school in Charleston, South Carolina. He was a part of the contingent of the first IC students, the Immaculate Conception students taught by the Oblate Sisters of Providence, who integrated Bishop England. And it was really interesting in his recollections. He noted how successful he was at Bishop England because of his great education by the Oblates at IC. He always credited them. He also noted that he converted to Catholicism as a result of his time at IC by the Oblate Sisters of Providence. He noted, quote, "My family attended Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal in Charleston. However, my mother sent 8 of her 9 children to Immaculate Conception School taught by the Oblate Sisters of Providence of Baltimore, Maryland. She was impressed by the educational standards and discipline of the Oblates. All of us started in kindergarten. In the 6th grade, I decided to convert to Catholicism with the support of my mother and father. My Catholic education taught me the importance of serving God through service to my fellow man. I first became an altar boy, now altar server, elected the president of IC, Catholic Youth Organization, and so on and so on." He also noted how he participated in the civil rights movement while in high school, and noted that his decision to play basketball at Bishop England was made to break down one barrier to racial conciliation in Charleston. Upon reflection, most of my career choices were influenced by Catholic social teachings. And he is citing the Oblates over and over again. And he has just told us that he also helped to integrate the basketball team at Bishop England. Now, who was his coach? This is Sister Mary Paul Lee, the child of John Lee, the first African American to ever play in a Catholic basketball league. Now, the story in terms of Johnny Lee, as they knew him, was that he was on this league and there was their championship game and the other team refused to play against a team with a black student on there. In response, all of his white teammates said, well, we won't play if Johnny Lee doesn't play. And so they played. And it was a championship team. However, his daughter, Mary Paul, and this is Mary Paul on the left. When she was in high school, Catholic high school in Philadelphia, she was not allowed to travel for away games because the other teams would not play with a black player on the team. Now, unlike her father, her white teammates did not show any solidarity and would just get on the bus. If you read her obituary, she talks about how painful that was. Yet, if you go to other graduates of IC schools and who were coached by Sister Mary Paul Lee, they all say and credit her with their skill and the fact that they won so many state championships. Indeed, this is Louis James, who also has a very similar story, was not Catholic, but educated by the Oblate Sisters of Providence, talks about how disciplined they were, sometimes punishing, but nonetheless loving. But also note, by the way, the first person I ever saw do a crossover dribble was Sister Paul. As every other member of the girls and boys state teams did. She was their teacher. And so when you hear Arthur McFarlane saying, I had all this encouragement, I had all this training, I was prepared, but I also desegregated this basketball team. This is Mary Paul Lee teaching her students and giving her students the opportunity to do something that she could not do. That's the legacy. And indeed, when we think about her father, Johnny Lee, there is a recreation center named after him in West Philadelphia. Most people don't know that it's named after John Aloysius Lee Sr., but it's because he founded all of those black basketball teams for women and men, golf teams, swimming teams, etc. How do we not know this history? It's in our face over and over again. It's the legacy in our faces. And indeed, when we think about why Venerable Mother Mary Lange matters, in 1835, the quote that is most associated with Mother Lange emerges from a letter that she wrote in 1835 when the head of the Sulpician Seminary asked the members of her community to serve as domestics for the slave-holding priests and seminarians at the nation's first Catholic seminary. And of course, she is running an order of teaching sisters, but they need the money, so they choose to do so. But she only agrees to allow her sisters to serve as maids to these priests, slaveholding priests and priests in training, by requiring separate accommodations to provide protection for her students, for her sisters. And she says, our soul wishes to do the will of God. And they do this. But afterwards, the community repeatedly refuses to do domestic work for anyone else because they are educators first. Theirs is the story that reminds us that the story of America's real Sister Act is the story of how generations of African American women and girls fought against racism, sexism, and exclusion to answer God's call in their life and minister as women religious. It's very likely that I will not live to see the time in which Mother Lange is declared a saint. I pray that it comes in my lifetime, but it may not happen. What I hope I've done, and what I hope my book has done, and what I hope people will continue to do, is to demonstrate that her story is a story of a miracle. In fact, of two miracles. One, the miracle of the establishment of a Roman Catholic sisterhood freely open to black women and girls in the slave society of Baltimore, Maryland in the 1820s. And also another miracle that those women are still with us. And they've left us a legacy of love, of resistance, and of true Catholicism. Thank you.
A few minutes for questions. If you have questions about the presentation or anything like that. Yes.
I noticed on one of those pictures they have there, the name Phyllis Wheatley.
Yes.
Okay. My mother used to play at YMCA here in Atlanta named after 50 people. And my mother this year would have been 104. So that's going way back. And the building is still being used right now on Texas Street, across from Marshall College.
Thank you. So if you didn't hear that, it was just sort of a question about noticing on one of the images. It was from the Ritagram, which was the student paper of the St. Rita's Academy in St. Louis. That was the Oblate's high school for girls, but also it was a boarding academy. The Ritagram, and that was from November 1938. So just to give you a sense of how early the Oblate Sisters of Providence were teaching Negro history, but also the important, what is now Black history, but also important to remind us that they were always teaching Black women's history, that they are champions of the leadership of Black women and girls. So when we think of someone like Angel Reese or so many of the other graduates who went on to equally distinguished careers, that this was something that they were doing, instilling racial pride, teaching self-determination. And it's important because in the case of St. Francis Academy and why so many members of the Oblate Sisters of Providence joined the National Black Sisters of Conference and why they are not afraid of the term Black Power, as one former principal of St. Francis Academy said, she said, well, that's what we've been doing all this time, right? If it means self-definition, self-determination, pride in self, quality education, that's what we've been doing. We've just found a name for what we've been doing. And so it's very significant that they fight to keep their schools open during the period of desegregation, because the Oblate Sisters of Providence and many of the historically Black sisterhoods never trusted desegregation. They said, what will happen if our children are not welcomed in white schools? They're going to need to come back to our schools. And now, some would argue that the need for those schools is severe, and they're not there anymore. And now we don't have the sisters. And so what will become of young people? Thank you.
It took me a moment to figure out what you were saying, because you repeated over and over again, the sisters were good at saving religious sisters' vocations and all. And I wanted to just remind you that they were also excellent in saving many African American priesthood vocations. We considered these ladies our mothers away from home. I told you a little bit about my knowing her. This is Sister Antonia Ebo, and I knew her ever since I was a freshman in college. They gave us strength because many of the priests felt so beaten down. And so oftentimes we heard from them anger. But the sisters had a calmness about them. And if you speak to people from Father Maurice Nutt to Father Manuel Williams, myself, the former Father Jesse Cox and all, they reached out to us and they took interest in our vocations. Some lost touch after priesthood, fearing that we would become clerical. That's that struggle between what's going on in the dominant culture and trying to maintain what goes on in our own culture. But they were our mothers.
Thank you for saying that. If you didn't get a chance, if you didn't hear that, he was also saying that they were also essential in preserving the vocations for Black men called to the priesthood. And indeed, what's very significant, of the first two generations of Black men who became priests in the United States, over half of them were educated by Black sisters. Now this is significant because Black sisters never made up more than 1% of the national population of sisters, but they educate over 50% of the first two generations of Black men who are called to the priesthood. So to give you a sense of how important they are in nurturing those vocations, but also identifying the vocations, sort of seeing it within those vocations. Because I think it's important to remember, it's not just simply that white sisters are not welcoming Black women and girls into their ranks, they're also suppressing those vocations. You know, women said, you know, they're saying no, but they said they wouldn't even invite us to the moments when the visiting vocational directors would come and meet with the young girls. The Black girls were never invited. I think the important thing to remember too is when we consider sort of the legacy of racism and white supremacy within the church is the lost vocations, because we can't even begin to name them. So many of the women that I interviewed, they said, you know, I did not even submit an application. I asked my teacher. I asked the visiting vocational director. The rejection was oral. So there's no written documentation of the rejection. So we have no sense of how many vocations that we actually lost over the years. We have some sense because the white Jesuit in the 1940s and 50s was doing some of that calculation, but we've lost so many because he leaves religious life in 1959 because he is heartbroken, I'll say heartbroken by the church. But again, it's a part of that story, not only in terms of the preservation of vocations of young black women and girls, and let me also say white women, right? The one thing that I want you to understand is that the Oblates are not like white sisters. The Oblates never exclude anyone from their institutions. White children can always come to the Oblate schools. They are educating white children in the 19th century. And also in the 20th century, and they're accepting white women into their ranks. The first to apply is in 1959. She comes and she remains until her death, as does the second and the third. So it's not a situation of it's two sides. The Oblate Sisters of Providence are living a truly Catholic life because they are saying that faith comes before race. Their white counterparts are not doing that. And that's what makes their story so dangerous, but also so essential to us. It is impossible to tell their story accurately and honestly without confronting the church's mostly unreconciled histories of colonialism, slavery, and segregation. We have to look at it straight. We have to call it what it is. It is not simply people acting out of their times, if the Oblate Sisters of Providence are also of those times, and they do not do that. And that is why the story is so dangerous, I would argue. Thank you.
That's a question I want to state here. I want to thank you, Professor Williams, for coming and sharing all this knowledge to everybody. But right now, I want to honor Monsignor Branch here, who for his years of service in our classes here in Atlanta, Georgia, was like that. To tell the truth and history of our black contributions to our faith, which has been overlooked for so many years, especially in the Atlanta Archdiocese.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank you for such a wonderful presentation and excellent research. I look forward to reading your work. I'm from the Bahamas, and I'm wondering if the Catholic nuns that educated me had some connections. They were Benedictines. I had many white nuns, but at the tail end of my Catholic education in primary school, I had some black nuns who were coming. I think they were educated in Minnesota. I don't know if they had a connection. But I wanted you to give me some references on a statement you made. The Catholic Church in the United States was the largest slave-holding organization. Can you speak to that, please? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. So in the United States, in Florida, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Louisiana, it was the largest corporate slaveholder. It was also the first. I think it's important to remember with the wonderful and fabulous 1619 Project, it does sort of ignore the fact that the Catholic Church inaugurated slavery more than 5 decades before in Florida. Our nation's oldest city is St. Augustine, Florida, in 1565. It's also the site of the first Christian marriage that takes place in the land area that becomes the United States. And that marriage is an interracial marriage. It's between a free black Catholic woman from Seville, Spain, named Luisa de Abrega, and a Spanish conquistador named Miguel Rodriguez. So that is where the church begins. Now in the Americas, the Catholic Church is the largest corporate slaveholder by far. Religious orders of men and women own thousands upon thousands of slaves. And to give you one source, before 1667, the Jesuits alone owned more people in the Western Hemisphere than any other entity. Before 1767, the Jesuits alone owned more. And religious orders of men and women, and then lay people, when you add that all together in the Americas, the church is the largest by far. I think what's important to remember that when we say American, we need to make sure that we don't center the United States. Because in the Americas, including Latin America and the Caribbean, what historians of American Catholicism understand is that the vast majority of people who have lived their lives under the signposts of Catholicism have been people of Native American and of African descent, not Europeans. The US story is different, and it's very much rooted in that history of racism. But even in the United States, Catholicism is the first black articulation of Christianity, and it comes through Florida, it comes through Maryland, it comes through Louisiana, it comes through Missouri, and Kentucky. In the case of even Dr. Patricia Gray, who is the founders of the National Black Sisters Conference, she's Pittsburgh's first black religious sister of mercy, but her family comes from the free black community of St. Mary's County in Maryland. I am convinced that every major development in the black Catholic community in the United States can be traced to about 20 or 25 black Catholic laywomen in those spaces. In Louisiana, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, and Florida. We have the names, they're in the records. They're in the baptismal records, they're in the confraternity records. So in those spaces, the church, from the very beginning, because the early American church is a Southern church, it's not a Northeastern church. And even when we talk about sort of the Northeast becoming the urban land, sort of the foot, you know, I guess sort of the main sort of space of the Catholic community, if you look at the census in 1880, the vast majority of Catholics in the nation are not in the Northeast. They're in Louisiana and they're in the West and the Southwest. It's Latino. That's where the concentrations are. So the numbers have always been in those spaces. And so what this history reminds us is that this diversity that some people think is new within the Catholic Church is very, very old. It's foundational to the church. Black Catholic history is just as old as European Catholic history, and so many black Catholics can trace their lineage to the earliest days of the church, not only to the free and enslaved black Catholics, but also to many of the European Catholics. So that is there. I also wanted to draw your, answer your question about the Benedictine sisters. So those Benedictine sisters were also founding members of the National Black Sisters Conference. They sent delegates in 1968. That community, so communities that ministered in the Bahamas refused to take black women. The Sisters of Charity of New York went there in the late 19th century, and they founded a separate community completely divorced from their community because they would not let Afro-Bahamian women into their communities. Something happened in the 1950s that community got suppressed. Some of those women went into the Sisters of Charity of New York, and the other ones went into that Benedictine community that's there. Because there's a sister, Annie Thompson, who was sent to Minnesota. Okay. But let me just say, those sisters that were a part of that separate community, although they were allowed to go into the Sisters of Charity of New York, they had to start all over. So although they had been sisters for over a decade, they had to start the process over again. In the archive, there is a documentation of the history of what went down. It is closed. One of the sisters, when I was there, one of the sisters was still alive, and there was a note on the file. You could not cite it until she had died. So it's in the archive right now. The sisters have written that story. I haven't seen it yet, but I've seen the file, and I've seen what happened, because she's dictated to what happened. But that's the story that I know.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. So my question is sort of related to the previous one, which is that a lot of religious history as it relates to African Americans in the United States, there's really a very strong emphasis on like Protestant expressions of Christianity, where to your point, there's this huge presence in the Americas broadly, but in the United States there's an old history of Black Catholicism and the participation of Black Catholics and Catholic social teachings in the civil rights movement is something that's completely like erased, and a lot of people are not aware of that presence, which was very strong and important. What do you think like Black Catholics or just Catholics in general can do to like give more presence to that history? You know, like we're celebrating the anniversary of the March on Washington, but a lot of people don't know that, yeah, there were Black religious sisters involved in that. So how can we express that history and let that be known?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. And the Oblate Sisters of Providence did march in the March on Washington. They were not supposed to, and it's not in the annals, but I have heard from multiple people, lay people and the sisters, that they were there. But on top of that, there were plenty of lay Catholics, Black lay Catholics there. One thing is to preserve the stories. On the one hand, and I'm going to end with this because it was just this week I was in my office and I got this letter. It was sitting on my desk, and I get too much mail. But this is a letter actually from a white lay woman in Minnesota who was educated in Pennsylvania. And she was writing because she had read my book and that she had just come back from her 55th class reunion. And she talked about working on the reunion planning committee with 2 Black Catholics. And they had attended Christ the King School in Shannen, Pennsylvania, led by the Oblate Sisters of Providence. And I just want to read this one line. She said, you know, she's a white Catholic. She said, I didn't know about segregation in the church. I should have. I'm sorry. You know, and she didn't really sort of know about sort of the racism of her parish, although she was like, I did. I just didn't really know. But she was talking about how this Black lay woman who was on her reunion committee talked about the Oblate Sisters of Providence and Christ the King, which had closed because it had flooded and they didn't reopen it, and all the children were forced to go into this public school and integrate and whatnot. And she said, I'll never forget her voice cracking when she said, those nuns loved us. And she's saying, and she's like, you know, there are some Black lay Catholics who want to tell their stories because they want to tell you about the Oblate Sisters of Providence, and they want to tell you their stories. So when you ask that question, what can people do? One thing that you can absolutely do in your parish, in your diocese, is start organizing to take the oral histories of the Black people there. Your elders know the stories. You are the keepers of this history. I was born in the 1980s. I don't know the stories that you know. People are leaving us, and the history is going away from us. The Oblate Sisters of Providence and also the other Black sisters, they are going away from us. Once we lose that history, it's going to be gone. So what you can do today, for those of us who are in the academy and who are writing this history, but also those of you, you've got to start collecting the stories. You've got to preserve it. And then you need to put these stories in university archives so scholars can come back to it. You need to make a digital archive. You have to tell your stories. You need to preserve it. I know this history, but you would be surprised at how many people told me that there was no meaningful story of Black Catholic sisters in the United States when I was a graduate student. I just was like, okay, keep playing with me. I'm going to show you. But I think that's one way that you can do it. And this is just also with regard to the fight for Black history. And I'll end with this. What's happening in Florida right now under a Catholic governor in the birthplace of Black and Catholic history underscores that Black history has always mattered. Black Catholic history matters. Indeed, what historians of the Black experience have always understood is that the greatest weapon of white supremacy has never been violence. It is the ability to erase the history of its violence and its victims. So when you are confronted with the silence past, the greatest thing you can do and the most radical thing you can do is to tell the story that was never meant to be told. So what you also have to do then is to preserve that story. You know it, you've told some people, but is it down? Is it recorded? Is it written? Is it in an archive? That's one place to start. And also you fight the bans, you fight people trying to suppress this history. Thank you.
Well, I don't really have much to say after all that. A couple things. First of all, thank you so much. That was an incredibly powerful presentation, and one that I'm going to be thinking about for a long, long time. We have a lot of food left over, and if you would like to take some of that food, we would really love you to take some of that food. So if you can, please do. The other thing is that this is the kind of programming that the Aquinas Center wants to do, that I, as the director of the Aquinas Center, want to do. This is the kind of programming, however, that does cost the center money. And so if, in addition to buying Shannen's book, which you should do first and foremost, if you can see it in your heart also to donate to the center, to help us to continue providing programming like this for the church here in Atlanta, we would really appreciate it. The way to donate is on a pamphlet that's at the back. There's a QR code, and that's the way that you can do that. That's also the way that you can do purchase Dr. Williams' book. I'm so grateful that you came here tonight. If you have not introduced yourself to me, please do, because I would like to get to know each and every one of you. Thank you.